I want to welcome Reinhard Messenbach. He's a partner and managing director at the Boston Consulting Group, also known as BCG, and he's an expert in cost and efficiency, and he's going to talk to us today about that, and especially about getting more costs removed and efficiencies in the support function of organizations. Thank you for joining us today. Thanks for coming to Philadelphia.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Steve.
You're also a co-author of a piece of BCG research, a recent piece that's called Beyond Cost Cutting. And I want to ask you about that. Cost and efficiency, it's been the focus for many companies in this long downturn, and yet it seems like some of them still haven't gotten it right. So could you talk generally about that there's still a lot that companies haven't learned yet?
Yeah. I think when we look at cost issues for companies, what we typically find is that there is reasons and scope well beyond cost that need to be addressed. So what do I mean by that? When we think of cost, it's basically a resource, people or anything you procure, and you put it to some sort of use. So beyond making sure you get it at a right cost level, you also need to make sure you use it to the appropriate sense that you want to achieve. And what we often find, especially in support functions, and that's the focus of this paper, is that this latter question, what do you get from your support function, is a terrible, difficult one. Because people do not see anything really being produced by these support functions. And hence, you can look at the cost of them, and often you find these efforts which we call cut and cope. So you reduce and then somehow hope people will do something sensible afterwards. But very often you find that people don't spend much time in thinking around what do these people and what should they be doing, and therefore give the support functions a different kind of role within an enterprise.
It's interesting because support function, by definition, the word support suggests it's not central to the company, right? It's a support function. And yet your study and a lot of your work is based around the idea that you're really missing something if you think of it that way. So could you talk about why the support functions are, in your opinion, far more important than most people give it credit for?
Yeah. So the reasons why we think support functions are critical, and that's also what evidence shows us, is they're first and foremost, they're close to the decision makers. So board members typically exercise power over the organization via support functions, and that being HR, finance, controlling, procurement. So via running, for example, a budgeting process with controlling, you exercise power over all your production facilities or your monthly reporting. So the support functions in that sense, they're basically brain and nervous system of an organization and help you to steer it. And hence, they're not just a cost bucket, and albeit often a small one compared to procuring large machinery or raw materials, but they're elemental for both the culture you have in an organization and also the way the whole organization is run.
You mentioned what some of the support functions are. It might be good to define what support functions are.
So it's a difficult term to define because support means different things in different industries. Just maybe picking one, in the banking industry, a risk function, monitoring credit risk, and is really closely embedded in the business, or at least it should be, while the same applies in an oil-producing company. But if you, for example, you're selling paper, then risk doesn't really come that close. And then it becomes more of a support function than a core business function. So we have, I think the typical functions that we always see is HR, finance, controlling, legal, strategy, business development. And then there's some more, let's say, special ones like compliance or risk, investment, procurement, which have a bit of a business speciality to them, depending on the industry you're in. And then within them, we find different roles they actually do. So, for example, let's say in HR, you have something which is quite strategic, like setting the leadership training program or recruiting the right leaders and developing them. And then you have some very transactional activities and roles, like payroll, for example. So again, these support functions then have to live these double lives of being, on the one hand, a driver of the business and the business agenda of the senior management, while on the other hand, doing some transactional things cheap and to high quality standards.
You mentioned finance as being a support function. Some might think that finance was a core function, so maybe we could drill down into that idea of what a support function is a little bit more.
Okay, let me give you another way of defining this. When we define support functions, what we are typically include in there is anything that doesn't have direct client interaction. So finance interacts with other departments, be it sales or procurement, but it typically doesn't interact with the real customers of a company. And these parts of a company that basically lie within the company and help to run it, that's what we call support functions.
What key issues do you tend to see around your clients when it comes to support functions on a strategic level?
What we often see is that there's a difference between what the enterprise actually tries to achieve, the company, and what these support functions are delivering. So one of the core questions is, what role should a support function actually exercise? Should it be, for example, be the driver of the business, or should it provide numbers, to stay with the finance example? And depending on that role that you give your finance department, you have a very different setup. And you have probably different distribution of resources between the finance function and the actual production facilities. And you have a completely different governance. So if you have a center function in finance that is driving the business, you might have a finance committee that's chaired by finance. While if you have very strong production areas who are actually using finance as a provider of numbers, you might not have such a committee and that sort of governance. So it's crucial to organize based on what you try to achieve, so that you have clear understanding of the role and the mandate of a support function.
What do you typically find companies are missing when they look at these functions from the strategic level?
What we often find is that these support functions, they evolve and develop over time. So after several years and maybe after some changes in the environment, you find that the role that the support function is actually exercising doesn't fit what the company really needs. So you might have an HR function that is trying to exercise some sort of process control in the various businesses, while these businesses do not want that. And what happens? So you then start to replicate functions. So let's say the recruiting guys from the HR center function, they try to recruit for the business, but the business doesn't want them to recruit for them. So they build their own people, and then HR tries to put a layer on this and, for example, creates a recruitment board. So then the business needs to employ people, the business line, to actually provide data for that recruitment board and support it. And over time, you actually create complex structures which all come from not discussing what the real role of HR should be. Should they provide that sort of support or should they not? And if you do not align this, you create inefficiencies. This special thing about the support functions is that you do not see these inefficiencies, or we might call it waste in lean. You don't see this lying around on the shop floor. So after some time, people find themselves complaining about complex processes, long time to decision, endless amounts of alignment, which they've all created themselves, but they don't remember what actually led to that sort of situation. And that's what they find themselves in. And in order to overcome it, they typically build another layer on top of it, another governance, another committee, another person who handles and provides more data, and that usually escalates the problem rather than solve it.
That's at the more strategic level. What about at a tactical level? What kinds of mistakes do you see going on?
Okay. Well, let's assume the actual mission of a support function and the leadership's idea of what they should do, that's aligned. Then the next step is to operate in the right structures and processes. And so we have to, first of all, typically we look at structures. And structures, we mean two things. One is the org chart. How many layers do you have? And thereby, how fast does information flow up and down in the organization, and how distributed is it across boxes? What do you lump together so to ensure a flow of information? The other part that's also important is what's your actual relation to the businesses. I'll give you an example. We worked with a client where we found that the businesses were very self-mandating. So they were doing basically all HR work in the HR department themselves. So they had their own HR people, they did people development, training, recruiting, and so on. So after discussing this, they decided that it would make much more sense to do some very operational things like shift planning at the place where it really needs to happen in the sites, but to bundle the more general things like training via the HR department, but have the people still sit where they were originally sitting. So getting the governance and the location of the people right so that you both have effects of bundling things, but at the same time you are close to the business where you need to be close to the business. As a second step, processes and service levels need to be aligned. What do we mean by that? It's important to have a discussion around how often do you need something, how big does it have to be, how deep and how well explained. So a typical thing where this happens is and goes overboard are reports. We tend to find many reports. None of them are made with bad intentions, but they typically, after some time, the reason why you create a report and the fact that you create a report, they don't match anymore. So, for example, a few years back, we helped an energy company in Germany, and that was in the 2000s, and they were still producing a report for the Allied forces, which have left many years back. Yeah? And it's not that they didn't know history. It was basically they produced that report, someone found it useful, and it got a life of its own. And after a time, it was still existing. So looking at, for example, the list of reports, understanding who does really need it, how often do you need it, how deep does it have to be, you can cut it down and thereby also install interaction between those who provide a service and those who actually use it, and thereby have a discussion which you often find doesn't exist.
You also write about in the study and talk about elsewhere the idea of complex, historically grown structures that just grow up and keep going, similar to the report example that you used later. And then there's no feedback loop with customers to get things aligned and on track. Could you talk about that whole idea?
Yeah. Now, I think first of all it's important to mention no one creates inefficiencies on purpose. So these things grow over time, and what we find is that one of the typical mechanisms, if something happens, we add things. So that's also one of the reasons why it's so difficult to overcome it. When you discuss with the head of risk whether he needs another person to fulfill some sort of Bank of England's new regulation kind of report, you can't win, because obviously this report is required, otherwise the bank will close. So having a discussion around priorities of all the other things that you're actually doing in your department, and then finding out, could we leave something out, could we do something more efficient, is a different way of tackling these things. And historically, what we find is that people usually don't have these sort of discussions. You don't have a discussion between someone who's doing something and their internal customers in a structured way. You have discussions when a need comes up, that someone raises their hand and say, I need more resource, another person, another building, another machinery, whatever, because there's something. And then you have a very small, tight area in which you discuss, and in which you always tend to lose if you try to win it. A customer of mine said it's easier to send a camel through a small hole in a needle than to get a forklift out of the budget in one of our factories. And that's because once you discuss the forklift, people will come to you and say everything will break down if we don't have the forklift and we can't deliver to China anymore and so on and so forth. But you don't have a discussion about priorities. And would there be something else we could do and decommission and thereby actually fund the forklift? So this, what can we do instead? What are our total priorities? How do we use all of our resource base? That's a discussion we often find is missing. And that enables a lean but also a focused center and support function that do things that their customers actually desire and want them to do.
You bring up this specific point of not having a proper feedback loop around this issue. Could you talk about that?
What's often difficult for support functions is that they don't have someone who is giving them orders or who demands things from them. So they tend to self-mandate themselves. So all of a sudden you find in your inbox an email from someone who says, we have now delivered and developed a new training manual for something, or a new training course, or a new procurement process, and so on. And people ask themselves, where is this coming from? Who asked for it? And why is it useful? So these questions tend not to be raised, and the actual support function is self-mandating. And thereby creating, in all honesty, they're trying to do the best for the company, but they might often, so best intention is often the worst action. And therefore, what's really critical is to have a feedback loop between those who create a service, like a new procurement process, and those who are on the receiving end and who actually have to live with it. So there are decisions taken whether the whole element to which you do this, the whole complexity is actually serving a purpose or not. And then in worst case, you can escalate this to your board members for them to decide whether you want to have more clarity and crisper procurement process, to stay in this example, or you want to have leaner, smoother, more flexible ways of procuring things. And you can take that decision then based on a discussion rather than the opinion of one unit, which is basically creating their own work.
One obvious question is, why don't companies fix this? They don't see it. What's the problem? It sounds like there's a lot of issues they should be seeing some of them, one would think.
I think that takes us to some sort of specialities or of human behavior. I think after living in a complex process for a while, people tend to live with it and manage within a process rather than stepping out of it and trying to fix it. So what we often find is that if something doesn't work, people tend to put extra resource on top of it or another governance layer in order to fix it. So if your budgeting process creates strange numbers, people basically extend the whole process and put maybe some extra checkpoints into it and a budgeting governance body in order to run it, rather than step back and say something doesn't work here, we need to do it differently, but we still need to stay lean. So you often find that there's extra control if something doesn't work, rather than fixing the original problem. And again, this is not because people are stupid, but because they come out of an environment they are used to, and so their solutions are typically fitting the environment they find themselves in. And one of the core elements to overcome this, especially in companies, and you mentioned it at the beginning, some have gone through 1-2 rounds of cost reduction or cost optimization, is really to change the whole setting in which such discussions happen. You need to help people to find a reason why now it's possible to do things differently. So think differently about the whole way of how we run things, think differently about the whole amount of services we provide, the service levels we provide, the way we interact. And that is often the difficult thing. How do you really break this up so you have a discussion which is free of historical other discussions that have happened in the past, and thereby allow to really radically transform the support functions, and thereby then also indirectly the rest of the organization.